Cold open question of the week, Gary.
Yes, sir.
If you could go back to see Elvis, Michael Jackson, or Prince in concert, which one would you choose?
Ooh, that's a good one. Man, I'd like to go see all of them, but my wife's a big Elvis fan, so I think I would have to say we'd have to go back and see Elvis.
Elvis. Okay. I give that question now to our guest, Chris DeVille.
I feel like it would have to be Michael Jackson for me. Uh, I mean, like, I think obviously, yeah, they're all iconic performers. Uh, I feel like I probably missed a chance to see Prince during my lifetime. There was probably an opportunity there that I squandered. Um,
I
and
wasn't sure when I came up with this question. I said, I wonder if Chris has seen maybe Prince. I wasn't sure.
No, I mean, other than just watching the Super Bowl halftime show,
Yep.
I think the Michael Jackson Super Bowl halftime show, I wasn't really watching the NFL yet at that time. I was still pretty little. Uh, but yeah, I think MJ, just in terms of like the number of songs that have personal meaning for me and just like the way that it soundtracked my life and sort of the mystical legendary quality of the live performances, I would have to be him despite whatever, you know, character issues there might be to factor in.
Yeah. Yeah. I probably would go with Michael Jackson just because I think the performance and the music is probably much bigger. And kind of like you say there, Chris, there's more of a personal connection to the music for me than with Elvis or Prince. But we are going to talk a lot more music and some NFL. So let's get started on the show. All right, welcome into another exciting episode of the Brian Lennon Show. As always, I'm your host, Brian Lennon, and joined always by my co-host, Gary McDaniel. And tonight we have Chris DeVille joining us. He is an author whose book, Such Great Heights, The Complete Cultural History of the Indie Rock Explosion, I recently read, and which explores, according to Chris, how indie rock changed the mainstream and the mainstream changed indie rock in the 21st century. The book was named one of Rolling Stone's best music books of 2025. Chris is currently the managing editor of stereogum.com, which is one of the first MP3 blogs and continues to be the leading online community for independent and alternative music news, downloads, and videos. In addition to his writing and editing duties, Chris has written for publications such as The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Rolling Stone, The Ringer, and Deadspin. So welcome into the show, Chris.
It's really great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, I was at my public library and I was looking at some of the new books that they had on there, and the thing that caught my eye was the microphone. So being a podcaster, I thought, oh, this must be a book about podcasting, and I picked it up. And it was talking about sort of the indie rock explosion. And there's a number of bands featured on the front cover that I am familiar with my days as a manager for Gap and American Eagle.
Yeah.
And back in the early 2000s, those companies would fill the stores with the music and the videos from a lot of those indie artists. So that's where I kind of became familiar with the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, Modest Mouse, and some others. So it was sort of an interesting time for me. We'll get back into that as we discuss the book. But I just want to take a few minutes to kind of get your background in music and journalism and how you kind of fell in love with music. Obviously, you're a huge music fan.
Oh, yeah.
And also how you kind of got the writing bug.
Yeah. So I'm a lifelong Ohioan. I grew up in the Columbus area, which is where I live now. I went down the road to Ohio University for college, which is not Ohio State. It predates Ohio State, and yeah, so I studied journalism there from 2002 to 2006, and as soon as I graduated, even before I graduated, I was fortunate to get a job back in Columbus writing for Columbus Alive, which was a weekly paper here in Columbus. And it was, I mean, this is kind of just giving you my career history first. I can give you a little bit more background on that. But so I worked at Alive for 7 years, and then I came on staff at Stereo Gum in 2013. And now here it is 2026. I'm still at Stereo Gum. And those have been, the day jobs, and then the other publications you listed off. I've done a fair amount of freelancing on the side, in addition to my work at Stereogum. And yeah, so as far as how I got into it, oh man, well, as you know from reading the book, I talk about this a little bit, my origin story in chapter one. The first chapter of the book, I kind of do like a speed run of like what was indie rock in the 80s and 90s. But before I get into the sort of like prehistory of my book, I get into my own personal history and kind of how I discovered indie rock. I trace the footsteps of my musical journey. So yeah, I grew up in the suburbs of Columbus, and my dad played guitar. I spent a lot of time in the basement, kind of hacking away at his guitars and eventually my guitar. We listened to a lot of like Christian pop music when I was real young. That's like some of the first CDs I remember having when we switched over from cassettes to CDs. Um, I had, I had DC Talk, which was more like, the youth culture, but we had Michael W. Smith and Amy Grant and a bunch of the Christian pop artists. And then after that, I just kind of, as I got a little bit older, my tastes branched out a little bit. I started listening to the radio, started listening to pop radio. Became, I just was obsessed with music. Even before that, I was like sitting on the floor of my bedroom, reading the liner notes, listening to albums all the way through. Um, so yeah, I checked out CDs from the library. That was a huge thing. Just like, there's so much music discovery to be had still at your public library. Um, and started listening to the radio, started watching SNL, started watching MTV, and I got to MTV right after the whole grunge bubble had burst. You still had a lot of like the kind of post-grunge carpetbaggers like Bush were really big at the time. I mean, I like Bush. They were the first CD I bought with my own money was 16 Stone by Bush. But I had kind of missed, obviously I missed Nirvana. The first time I ever heard of Kurt Cobain was when I saw his face on one of my classmates' t-shirts, like kind of an RIP, like kind of t-shirt.
Okay.
Um, and yeah, so this is by this point we're talking about like the mid 90s, going into the late 90s. I got into a lot of like heavy stuff. A lot of that hacking away in the basement on guitar was learning how to play Metallica songs, like downloading the guitar tablature, or learning how to play. I was trying to play like Dimebag Darrell from Pantera, like learning how
Okay.
to do pinch harmonics, like making the strings squeal a little bit.
Oh,
Um, I could kind of do that pretty well when I was in like eighth grade. I don't think I could do it now. It's like the fine-tuned skills of my guitar playing. I got into pavement later, and so I learned to be just really sloppy instead. But Um, yeah, so long story short, I sort of, even though I was really into nu metal, and all the stuff that was popular amongst teenagers in 1998, uh, I did realize that I liked the more kind of like artsy fartsy side of nu metal, stuff like Deftones, System of a Down. Incubus was like my favorite band. I discovered Incubus on the Family Values Tour live album, which is the Family Values Tour was like Korn and Limp Bizkit, and it was kind of like one of the defining new metal package tours. And Incubus had kind of an early time slot on that, and so their song on the live album was really fascinating to me. And from getting into Incubus, uh, I mean, I think it kind of primed me to listen to a little bit more off-kilter, kind of slightly weirder rock music. Because like at first Incubus was really pulling a lot from like Faith No More and Red Hot Chili Peppers, and they were like kind of funky, but they were toggling between genres a lot, and they were just doing stuff that I hadn't heard other bands do. And then my friend, who was like kind of my music buddy, he later was one of my bandmates, and we went to a lot of concert road trips together and stuff. But he uh, he was turning me on to all kinds of music that he was finding through like Spin's list of the 100 best albums of the 90s. And so what what happened was that eventually I got really into Radiohead. And from getting really into Radiohead, I was like in all the online communities, reading all the uh, fan websites, downloading all of the like on Napster. Napster was really big at this time. This was like the year 2000, and
Yep.
Napster was like flourishing. Um, I was downloading all the B-sides and like, the live tracks and stuff, and they were ramping up to release Kid A. And I just got really, really into Radiohead. And so at the end of the year, these fan websites, they would just post every time a year-end list had Radiohead on it, they would link out to it. And that was how I discovered Pitchfork, which their their list had Radiohead on it, but a lot of the other stuff was not on other lists. Like it was stuff that I hadn't heard of before. And a lot of these bands are like fairly well known now, like Modest Mouse, for instance.
Mhm.
Um, but at the time, it was like I had never heard of Yola Tango. I had never heard of Godspeed You Black Emperor. There's all these bands that became super important to me personally, but they were just like a foreign language at the time. And so this just kind of became my portal into the world of indie rock, which is sort of the subject of the book. I've been a huge music fan for a lot of different genres over the years, but indie rock has definitely felt like kind of like my baseline, and that's why I decided to write a book about it because it was just I feel like the way that the genre has evolved was really fascinating and in some ways really controversial. And as you know from the book, there's just like a lot of different through lines, like with pop culture, just the different ways that the genre impacted pop culture and the different kind of pop cultural currents that came in that had some kind of bearing on the way that indie music evolved. So,
Yeah, I think you do a really good job because I having lived through it, but now looking back on it, with 20 to 10 years kind of, rearview mirror, I think you do a really good job of connecting some of the social, technological aspects of that time and how it impacted the music. And really how the music changes from some of those early sounds of like the Strokes and the Shins to where, Kanye West is sort of considered indie music. Now, as far as like your writing career, like did you write for the school newspaper? Is that where it kind of started? Was Pitchforks sort of that portal into like the written word?
I think I was into music criticism even before I was reading Pitchfork. Uh, I know for a fact that I made my first year-end top 10 list in 1999. And I believe that Red Hot Chili Peppers' Californication had the upset victory over Incubus on my list, which only existed on my PC in Westerville, Ohio. Um, but yeah, I was reading magazines a lot. Like I was starting to read Spin. Um, I somehow got a copy of CMJ New Music Monthly, which is like, the college radio magazine, and it used to come with yeah, it was one of those magazines that came with a CD in every issue.
Right.
Um, I had a few copies of Rolling Stone. And plus, like, I was just really into reading in general and reading media in general. Like, I would read the newspaper every morning. I had a phase when I would read the culture section every morning. I had a phase when I'd read the sports section every morning. I had Sports Illustrated for kids. I think that SI for kids, and then, when I graduated to regular Sports Illustrated, that was super huge for me um, in terms of like developing my obsession with the written word. It's like I remember I read, aside from magazines and newspapers, I was starting to read books about music, like the one that I would go on to write. Uh, I remember I was really into Jimi Hendrix in freshman year of high school, and I read like a 700-page Jimi Hendrix biography. And so I don't know at what point exactly that I decided I'm gonna do this myself. Definitely the high school newspaper. I got, I did journalism in high school,
Mhm.
junior and senior year. We had, you could work on the newspaper as like a class. And I definitely remember I reviewed Radiohead's Kid A for the high school newspaper. Thankfully, I think that that has been lost to time. I'm afraid to know, what the writing quality was like on that. But yeah, I know that for sure by the time I was in high school, I was like, wow, this is actually a job that you can do. Like there's a job where you're basically like paid to be a music fan. Like you get to like write about, you get free CDs and you get free concert tickets and you get to meet and talk to all of these musicians. Like, why wouldn't you want that to be your job?
Right. Now, the job you get right out of school with Columbus Alive, you said that was a weekly newspaper. Was that strictly like arts and entertainment?
Yeah, Columbus Alive. That they aired on the side of arts and entertainment. It was like it wasn't a traditional alt weekly.
Okay.
It was a lot more alt before I worked there. Because before I worked there, it was purchased by the Columbus Dispatch, which is the daily newspaper here in town, and they kind of rebranded it as they tried to make it a little bit more mainstream. And by the time it was shut down, it was like all the way back to being like an actual alt weekly newspaper. Like my friend Andy Downing, who worked there, he continues to run the equivalent of that as like a one-man operation called Matter News here in Columbus as like a nonprofit news operation. But yeah, at the time, he was doing like these in-depth investigative reports like on like abusive local business owners and stuff, and while also doing music criticism. When I worked there, I was just like writing about cool bands and writing about the Columbus Crew, which is like our local Major League Soccer team.
Yeah.
And we did a bunch of fluffy stuff like, contests to see who has the coldest beer in Columbus, which we very scientifically, we did like a bracket and very scientifically measured it by like going into all these different bars and ordering a a pint and sticking a thermometer into it.
Okay.
Um,
So it really was scientific. It
oh
wasn't
yeah,
just
yeah. But yeah, we got clowned a little bit in town for doing stuff like that because it was like Alive used to be like this ultra hipster uh, publication, and then I started working there when it was like kind of co-opted by the man or whatever. But we kind of like pushed to make it cooler or try to make it cooler. And I was there for 7 years, and I feel like it was, you know, I had a great experience there. I was writing about a lot of local musicians. Like that was when I was really enmeshed in my local music scene. I was trying to see as many different types of artists as possible. And I was also interviewing artists, like national and international artists, when they would come through town.
Right.
Uh,
I want to ask you about the book because it seems like you do a lot as far as like writing and the material. Is it a combination of everything you've kind of been doing since, Columbus Alive up to, last year? Like how did you kind of, I guess, put the chapters together and cull that information from for the book?
yeah, so the book, it's I don't think there's anything repurposed as far as the actual writing. There may be a couple of lines about the dismemberment plan that I took from a Stereogum article I wrote, but like it's all basically new material. But as far as the scope of it and like how I put it together, my thought process was around the time I around the time I started working at Stereogum. It was 2013. That was kind of like the peak of indie rock poptimism. It was like, I don't know if people are familiar with the term poptimism. It's kind of like a buzzy, controversial word, but like some people would tell you poptimism just means if it's popular, then it's good, and we have to like all gravitate towards, we have to praise whatever's the most popular. I don't think that's what it really means, but that's kind of like the oversimplified version of it. Um, it was more just supposed to be like, we shouldn't just write off certain genres because you know if isn't it kind of like weirdly biased to say like certain music that is beloved by teenage girls is lame because teenage girls love it? Like isn't that like sexist? And basically all kinds of music deserve a fair shot was the idea, and there was a real big push towards eclecticism and within music critic circles and sort of hipster circles. And I had noticed that basically by the point of 2013, you had like these indie pop stars. They were like sort of artisanal uh, pop stars that were being marketed to the indie audience, and you had like huge listening overlap between the rap world and the indie rock world, and you had tons of like electronic indie bands and synth powered indie bands, and it seemed like a lot of bands that came up playing guitar were kind of like running away from that and trying to rebrand as something else. And it was just like indie rock was kind of far from the zeitgeist within the kind of the music media ecosystem that I had discovered indie rock in. Like the thing that had turned me on to indie rock, it felt like that whole world of record labels and websites and just kind of online communities had all the trend was away from rock. And so I wanted to write a book about basically how indie rock went pop, like kind of how it morphed into pop, or how the word indie got stretched so far that it could be applied to like, it sort of the rock got detached from indie eventually, and so now you just kind of have indie music, and that certainly includes indie rock in the kind of like slacker 90s alternative rock sense. But there's so much different music that has kind of like fallen under the indie umbrella. And so I wanted to write a book about how that came to be, and like, how do you get from the point where indie rock means Pavement and Built to Spill and like Guided by Voices and Liz Phair to the point that indie rock means like the Taylor Swift Folklore album, because it was produced by Aaron Dessner from The National and featured Bon Iver, it was considered her indie album. And it's like Pitchfork, which introduced me to indie rock in the first place. Like, how did they end up having Carly Rae Jepsen performing at Pitchfork Music Festival? Um, so yeah, I thought that was like a fascinating evolution, and I really didn't want it to be like I think there's a version of the book that's like an angry diatribe about those changes because there are some people who were very upset about it. Um, but I like a lot of the indie pop music too. Like I still think I'm first and foremost like a rock fan above anything else, and I'm happy that the guitars kind of came back into style. Um, but yeah, I felt like it was just like an interesting phenomenon to study, or like I guess sort of a series of interconnected phenomena. And so putting it together, there's just like, I mean, there's a lot of different subplots that I wanted to cover, and a lot of them sort of made sense as their own chapters. So like the second chapter is about danceable indie music and how like the whole Strokes scene evolved out of these rock and roll dance parties. And then sort of at the same time overlapping with that, you had the rise of these dance punk bands that were taking a lot of influence from the late 70s post-punk movement. And at the same time, you had the rise of the Postal Service kind of creating the template for like a indie version of synth pop. And yeah, so when I was writing that chapter, for instance, it was like I was digging through tons of old interviews, trying to kind of like piece them together like a scrapbook, so to speak, and then kind of putting my own personal experiences, weaving those in along with the history. And so like there's a lot of history in every chapter that I kind of like blaze through. Um, a lot of quick hits. Not There are parts where I stop and linger for a little bit and pause to think, but there's definitely a lot of like we're going to cover as much territory as possible and pedal to the metal. And so it was just a matter of figuring out like how could each chapter tell a little mini story within the larger story.
Yep. We're talking to Chris DeVille, the author of Such Great Heights, the complete central cultural history of the indie rock explosion. One of the things I loved about the book was for each chapter, there's a soundtrack. And so, like you said, you'd kind of, do you have a total count of how many bands you reference in the book?
Oh my gosh. I should probably go through the index and see how many there are.
It's over 100, maybe close to 200.
Oh, I mean, it's so many. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
So,
mean,
as someone who has kind of reacquainted myself with that era of music, this is sort of like a reference guide as to like what to go back and listen to, which albums to go listen to. I never knew that Carly Jepsen had kind of gone into the indie lane. I always just knew her as Call Me Babe, Call Me Maybe, as a kind of one hit wonder. So that was kind of interesting to learn about that.
yeah, I mean, that was such an interesting pivot because that was coming at a time when the whole like indie goes pop thing was at its height, and she just got into a lot of that type of music, like stuff like Solange, which is Beyonce's sister, um, and Robin, and this was stuff that was getting hyped up by critics, and it was getting trumpeted by sites like Stereo Gum, where I work now, and Pitchfork, and I mean there were so many sites, and they were mostly sites. This was like mostly an online
Yeah.
world that were trumpeting. Uh, the eclecticism really was like the trend. It was like it's always been cool to have an eclectic music taste, but then it became cool to for that eclecticism to include stuff that used to seem like too mainstream or like stuff that was taboo because it was too mainstream. It suddenly like was cool to like that stuff. And it just it so happened that there were these a lot of figures who were from the indie world who were getting interested in making pop music, and a lot of them worked with Carly Rae Jepsen, and they happened to make like a classic pop album in 2015, uh, Emotion. I mean, I think some of my coworkers at Stereo Gum honestly were leading the charge in terms of like making her a an indie, you know, cause celebre. Like she was yeah, I don't know. That's one of the endpoints for me. Like I kind of feel like the book has it's kind of like the Lord of the Rings, how they have so many endings and you think it's over and then like there's another ending. That was like the whole Carly Rae moment I thought of as like one potential endpoint for the story that I was telling. Um, but yeah,
All right. I want to, one of the things you do really well too in the book is kind of weave technology and the role that it kind of plays in the evolution of the music and the music industry as a whole, because really there's nothing, I mean, really the 20th century was dominated by albums and then cassettes and then CDs, but wasn't really that drastic as what I think technology did. Um, you already mentioned Napster with the file sharing service. Talk a little bit, if you would, just kind of how technology touches points throughout this kind of musical journey for indie music.
yeah. So it really is. I realized as I was writing it, it's kind of like a shadow history of sort of personal internet technology. Um, like the beginning, I do talk a lot about Napster, and I think Napster played a huge role in just like creating more access to lots of different music. Um, and then as Napster was kind of like codified by the music industry into iTunes, um, in the iPod, like the MP3 was embraced by the music industry. That was huge for indie music for a few reasons. One was that like you could blow up without fitting into a radio format or like, without getting past an MTV gatekeeper. Like you just were able to uh if something was good, it could find an audience a lot more easily because it no longer had to get past gatekeepers. But also, I think everyone from my generation who grew up like, with MP3s and with iPods and stuff, like there was just a lot less of the defining yourself by one genre, like the metalhead, the hip hop head, the punk rock listener. You could just put all these different types of music on your iPod and just have them live together. And, there was shuffle, obviously, like people were shuffling their music all the time. Obviously, like it's not like there was nobody with an eclectic CD wallet before that, but the MP3 definitely it made the access so much easier too. Like it was like you didn't have to go out of your way to have an eclectic collection. Like it was really easy to just download whatever you wanted. And then MySpace came along with social media. That's another huge step in
Yeah.
this process. Well, I actually, before I even talk about MySpace, like the fact that you could publish online, that's another thing where it's like Pitchfork's a big part of the story, and they were able to establish a presence writing about indie music online at a time when magazines were just, you know, they were so far behind. Like you would have to wait for the next issue to come out to read the review. And it's like Pitchfork was publishing 5 reviews a day, 5 days a week, and they're just cranking out content and with an authoritative voice. And so like they kind of built an empire out of that, a taste-making empire. And it's like it wasn't just Pitchfork. There were so many people who just started publishing, especially as blogs became kind of like a big thing, all of a sudden you had music discovery through bloggers, like people who were just like hobbyists at home were able to broadcast their taste to the whole world. And so, yeah, the ability to find out about this stuff, it wasn't just you would find out about it because it was like on your on somebody's MP3 library in your dorm. Because the computers in dorms used to be like they would be connected to each other. You could see what was in somebody else's MP3 library. So it wasn't
Right.
just because of that. It was like the information about the music could be distributed online. And then so you get social media too. You get MySpace, the most popular social media network of the mid 2000s, is like centered on music. And it's another environment where it's like it's easy to click around from one thing to another. People are like can make their profile have a certain song playing on it. People can showcase their favorite bands on the front page, and it becomes this tool that bands can use to market their music. They can send out bulletins to the people who follow them. And then it's like, so this promo machine for bands is there. That was huge for all kinds of underground musicians. I mean, I talk in the book about how that was huge for the emo bands as well. And I have a little digression about the difference between indie rock and emo, which we don't have to get into here. You should just read the book to find that one. But yeah, so there was this whole MySpace thing, and they're really making it a point. MySpace and Apple both really defined themselves by like more alternative leaning music. And a lot of the stuff that was starting to emerge at the time that was kind of a hybrid between indie and pop was the kind of stuff that was being chosen by like the people programming Apple commercials.
Right.
And a lot of that stuff was being highlighted by like MySpace. They started throwing concerts too, and it was like I think about there's just so many artists that were sort of in the margins, not even in the margins, but in the cracks, like between genres that were benefiting from being on MySpace. But then I guess the third act of the whole tech aspect of the book is talking about streaming and how that kind of undid a lot of the infrastructure that benefited and cultivated indie rock. Um, like, when streaming came along, it kind of like, well, for one thing, the payouts were much lower. And so, like, independent labels were able to make a lot of money on iTunes because they were able to sell these MP3s without manufacturing anything. Um, and if they had a particular song catch fire, people could just hop on and download the one song that they wanted. And it was working pretty well for a lot of them. I have a quote that I got from an old Billboard article that went into the book where a guy who owned an indie label was like, CDs, it's like CDs break. You ship a box of CDs and they get lost in the mail. You don't have to worry about that. But then when streaming came along, it was like the profits went way down. People all of a sudden weren't buying music. I mean, people already, certainly sales of music declined from kind of the peak CD era when the MP3s came along, but streaming exacerbated that problem, and the amount of money that artists get per stream is so paltry. And so it made it harder to succeed it made being an independent musician a less viable career path. But also, it's like those streaming services kind of took over the role of cultural curator and music recommendation. Like a lot of the stuff that was happening on the blogs, it's like your algorithm just you're listening to one thing and then another song starts after that based on what you're listening to before.
Right.
Meanwhile, the blogs were really hurt by social media at that time too, because the conversations that were happening in blog comment sections started happening on Twitter. And so, yeah, it's like there's so much about the internet and technology that factored into uh, the way that this music blew up, the way that it evolved, the infrastructure that built up around it and then was torn down. Um, yeah, there's a lot to say about that.
Yeah, and that was really, and again, like I think Gary and I are turning 50 this year, and so I think we're a little bit older than you, and so kind of in, like I said, in 2000 I was working as a manager at Gap and American Eagle for those years, and my life had kind of changed because I wasn't buying as much music as I had, because I was buying diapers and formula and that stuff, and that's where my money was going to. But again, I was sort of in, I guess you want to call it the youth culture, because I was in the store every day listening to the music, talking to kids, what they were listening to. But I never really got like fully immersed into it. And so that's why I really enjoyed the book. Because it kind of like opened up my eyes. And like I said, I'll be looking up artists for probably the next few years that are mentioned in the book. I did also want to talk a little bit about, we talked a little bit about with like Apple and some of the companies featuring these bands, but I can swear when I worked at American Eagle, we had a like a promo with the OC, because you talk a
Hmm.
lot about the OC, the Fox kind of teenage drama that came out in 2003, where a lot of the music from that generation kind of came from that series. Um, so if you could talk a little bit more about sort of the like social impacts of brands using the music, especially like the OC, and even American Apparel was kind of in that.
Yeah, yeah. So for sure, I mean, the OC, that was like one of the things that got me thinking about this subject. Like, 10 years before I even sold this book, uh, I wrote an article for Stereo Gum about indie rock gentrification that was inspired by the 10th anniversary of the OC. And so it's like that was a TV show where, I mean, so there have been plenty of movies and TV shows that featured like hip underground music. Like that's kind of like a long, long tradition, is that like cool filmmakers will put cool music in their movies. Like that's not anything
Tarantino
new,
effect.
yeah, new or fresh. But like what was interesting about the OC was that like the cool music was like written into the script. Like it was, there was the character Seth Cohen who he defined himself as like, I am a fan of Death Cab for Cutie and Bright Eyes and the Shins, and like that's, these are crucial things about my personality that you need to understand, is that I'm a Death Cab fan. And this was at a time when Death Cab was like super obscure. Um, and So they got tons of exposure from the show because this was like an ongoing plot point in the show. It was like a defining characteristic of this character was he would talk about these indie bands that he loved, and then by the second, so even before the second season, but in the first season they started putting out soundtrack albums, music from the OC, and they would post on the website, here's the artists that were featured in the show tonight, or the songs that we played in the show tonight, so you can download them on iTunes. And then it became such a big part of the plot that in the second season they created a music venue that Seth worked at, and they would have these buzzy indie bands come through and perform on the show, like kind of in the background. Uh, and so it's like Modest Mouse and the Killers were on there. That was like part of how Mr. Brightside ended up in the top 10 on the pop charts, was the Killers appeared on the OC and performed at the venue there in town. So there, this whole kind of like launch pad for mainstream friendly indie bands kind of developed out of the OC. And that was at the same time that Zach Braff made Garden State. And he had the scene in that movie where like Natalie Portman is like, you got to listen to this song, it'll change your life. And she puts the headphones on his head, and it's the Shins' new slang. And so like the Garden State soundtrack became a big deal. And a lot of people's conception of like what indie music is based on the Garden State soundtrack, which, you know, it won a Grammy for Best Soundtrack. And when Zach Braff hosted SNL, they kind of like parodied the Garden State soundtrack. And so there was this whole kind of cottage industry within Hollywood for the next several years after that of movies where indie rock was kind of like woven into the plot. A lot of them starred Michael Cera. Um, and so, yeah, there was that whole aspect of kind of big business using indie rock as like the new cool youth culture that we're going to try to use to sell advertisements on our programming. And then as far as fashion brands too, I mean, fashion is probably the area of culture that I know the least about as far as things that appeared in the book. But definitely Urban Outfitters was a huge one. You know, they had vinyl records available at Urban Outfitters that, you know, a lot while you were there buying your clothes, you could buy a cheap record player and some vinyl. But even the fashion, like sort of as this idea of the hipster sort of made its way out into the mainstream in the 2000s, uh, the uniform, the outfit of the hipster kind of became popular. And so sort of the thrift store clothes that you associate with like maybe a 90s indie rock hipster or early 2000s, it came to the point where like at Urban Outfitters you could just buy a version of the sort of hipster thrift store outfit just off the rack. um, Meanwhile, American Apparel, they were doing these, you know, they branded themselves with all of these kind of like soft core photo shoots. And it really overlapped with what was happening with Vice magazine, which was another big driver of hipster culture at the time, sort of the more like edgelord side of the hipster world. And so, yeah, American Apparel is like we're ethically made, and you know we're American made, and we pay our workers a fair wage and all this stuff. And so we're really into progressive values, but also we're like really into like skeezy exploitative photo shoots. And so that really kind of aligned with sort of the Vice state of mind that was happening at the time, sort of crass, um, sort of party oriented version of indie that was starting to explode out into the mainstream. So yeah, there was the fashion aspect, there was the TV and movie aspect, there was the internet aspect. There's all kinds of stuff going on.
Yeah. All right. Before we, I have some kind of rapid fire questions for you. I want to ask you. Before we do, we're just going to give a quick thank you to our sponsor, Rap Brewing Company. Gary's going to tell us what's going on at Rap Brewing.
Rap Brewing, located at 10930 Endeavor Way, Seminole, Florida. This coming Saturday, the 31st, chili cook-off. Come on out. Come try my chili. Going for my defending my title this weekend, so trying to go for 2 in a row.
Now, Chris, I have a chili question for you because I think Ohio has their own sort of chili, right?
You know, are you talking about like Skyline?
Skyline.
Yeah, that's more of a Cincinnati thing. Like we have it up here in Columbus, but I think, you know, I can't understand it like a person from Cincinnati would understand it.
Okay.
I just I prefer like I don't know if you would call it normal chili, but I not what I get at Skyline.
Okay. You have meat in your chili?
Yes.
Beans?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I like many different chilies. You know, I've had some like white chicken chili that's been really good too.
Yeah. Not bad.
I've made that before. Yeah. All right, Chris, I had just had some like uh, personal curiosity questions about music, and so I want to ask you those. So we'll do that. Um, Blink 182, their song "I Miss You," is that considered indie?
I would say that's more pop punk, emo. There's a lot of people who are in the, I feel like in the 2010s, the line between indie and emo blurred a lot, and uh, it had already been blurred, 20 years before that, but then there was kind of like a separation for a time. Um, but I think of Blink 182 as a pop punk band, and obviously I Miss You is not, you know, it's not their most pop punk song. That's one of the ones that sounds like The Cure, right? So
Yeah.
I guess it's kind of like probably the most indie of the Blink 182 songs.
Okay. Gary is a Mumford and Son fan.
Oh no.
Is I was surprised to read your book, kind of how there's a sort of disdain for Mumford and Son among the indie people. Is that when indie jumped the shark, if you will?
Well, it's interesting because like now I feel like Marcus Mumford has I feel like he has a little bit more cred than he did with like the indie audience 15 years ago. Or at least like a lot of the artists that get a lot of critical acclaim are friendly with Mumford and Sons and would interact with them. But at the time when they were starting to blow up, yeah, it kind of felt like there had been this rise in indie folk music in the late 2000s with like Fleet Foxes and Bon Iver. I mean, there had been like the whole freak folk thing happening earlier in the decade, but this was kind of like a little bit smoother, a little bit more palatable for mass consumption. And it felt like Mumford and Sons were like a tipping point of sorts where it became a little bit, I don't know, it sort of just lost the cool factor for me. It took the edge off a little bit too much. And I mean, I think they've written some great songs, and there's definitely songs that get stuck in my head. And uh, any trash talk that I brought into the book was like being projected from the 2011 version of me, more so than like my current stance on them. Like, I don't think like I'm a full-fledged Mumford hater or anything like that. But at the time, it's just like there is I think the version of the hipster that persists in the pop culture imagination now is not like the trucker cap wearing, like tank top wearing, mustache, like bushy Midwestern type mustache. Like it's more like the sort of overly twee handlebar mustache, like craft beer, artisanal everything, like beard oil, wearing a pork pie hat. Like I think that that sort of became for a lot of people what a lot of people associated with like indie music was like sort of the Mumford sort of old-timey urban persona. And yeah, it kind of felt like a caricature maybe at the time. Uh,
Okay.
but there's also always like the gatekeeping of like if stuff didn't come up through certain channels. I mean, I don't know if that really applies to Mumford because they signed to Glassnote and Glassnote was like Last Note had like a really interesting mix of like artists that were critically acclaimed and loved beloved by hipsters and artists that like hipsters just despised. And yeah, for whatever reason, I mean, I guess for some of the reasons that I just rattled off, Mumford was kind of like an easy target for people who felt like the indie folk thing was kind of jumping the shark.
Okay. Your favorite concert you've ever attended?
Ever. Oh man. Um,
Is there one
whew.
that sticks out that you'd want to go back and relive?
Yeah, so there's this band I talk about in the book called The Dismemberment Plan that I feel like they were doing danceable indie rock before most other people were. They were taking pop and rap and R&B seriously, but not in a way that was like really like Craven, and it wasn't like sellout minded. It wasn't a way for them to become like less weird or less interesting. They just recognized those as viable musical genres, and so they made like really fun, very quirky, danceable indie rock. And I got really into them right at the end of high school. And then, so when I got into college, I was driving all over the place. I saw them like 7 times in a year. But they announced during that year that they were breaking up. And so, probably my favorite time seeing them was I drove down to see them in Lexington, Kentucky, in the back room of an art gallery. And it was just like a revelatory experience. It was like one of the first times I saw a band that I was a huge fan of in a really, really intimate venue. Like, I mean, like, I didn't really go to like hardcore shows growing up, like at the VFW hall or whatever. Like,
Mhm.
I went, I was used to seeing bands that I liked at like a 1,000 capacity club. And this was and I was used to seeing local bands. Once I had gone to college, I would see local bands in small venues, but this was like a band that had become very, very important to me. And I was seeing them in a room full of probably like 100, maybe 200 people, with just no stage, the band playing on the floor. uh, I was just right up practically on top of them. They just put on the most amazing performance. They had this gimmick where during their best song, they would invite everybody to come on stage and dance around them, which was just like this incredible, like fourth wall breaking thing for me. And I believe that was the first time I ever did that. I ended up dancing on stage with them a few times. But yeah, that was just such a magic experience. I think they literally announced the day after that show that they were breaking up. And I was like, no. Um, but that was a really amazing experience. If I could go back and relive one, that would probably be the one.
Okay, that sounds cool. Your favorite indie musician you've met or interviewed?
Oh, okay. Well, I actually Well, Eric from the Dismemberment Plan, actually, we have like a pen pal relationship where we write about Major League Soccer. But
Okay.
but I think maybe Matt Berninger from the National. I've had a few back and forths with him. He's been a big supporter of my writing. And I'm just like, I live in Ohio, obviously, but I had this kind of like, I always liked the National, but I went to their festival in Cincinnati in 2018, I want to say it was. And I was just like radicalized. I became like a national dad. And I'm like, you know, I guess like I just reached a point where I was old enough where I started to understand like some of the vibes that were coming off of now they print off they sell t-shirts that say sad dads now. Um, and so yeah, although he's one who I've only really communicated with online in terms of like people that I'm not like just living in Columbus. I don't have like a lot of like tight bros in the music scene that I'm just like hanging out with every day. Um, but that's been part of the blessing and the curse from being in Columbus, is that like I do feel like some of the world that I inhabit professionally, I just can close my laptop and put down my phone and it all goes away, as opposed to if I was living in Brooklyn, for better and for worse.
Okay. You talk a little bit about guilty pleasure. Sugar Ray is one of my guilty pleasures. Talk a little bit about the idea of guilty pleasures and how it's maybe not so bad to have that guilty pleasure.
Yeah, so part of the idea of poptimism is that uh, if it's good, it's good. You don't need to feel bad about liking something because it's from a particular genre or like uh, because it's cheesy or whatever. Like if you like it, there's probably some good reason that you like it, and you should appreciate what you like about it. Um, but I don't know. There are still sometimes things that I like, and then I'm kind of embarrassed to like. I think the new guilty pleasure is probably going to be like AI generated music. Like when you hear a song and then you find out that it's AI generated, I feel like that's going to be something that we all have to grapple with. Like, oh man, I really liked that song, but now now I find out that it's not human created. That really taints it for me, but I think that's probably going to be the new guilty pleasure. I'm trying to think of some guilty pleasures from my past in terms of like songs that I mean, there's a lot of, I think probably the closest thing over the last few years has just been all the children's music in my household. There's been some really obnoxious children's music that I have like kind of developed Stockholm syndrome with.
I've been there. Gary and I have been there.
Yep.
Um, I'm a big Stone Temple Pilots fan. But I'm curious about Scott Weiland because he had two solo albums, and I was wondering if you're familiar with them and what you would judge those as. Would those be considered indie?
It's a good question. I actually love Stone Temple Pilots. I think that they're super underrated. I like to piss people off by saying that they're better than Pearl Jam. Um, that's one of my obnoxious takes. I actually do believe that. Like I would, if I had to choose one discography versus the other to like keep forever, like it wouldn't even be a question for me. But like I realize that it's kind of like poking the bear to like make a big stink about it. Um, I
I'm with you.
I
I'm with
spent
you.
a lot of time listening to I listened to 12 Bar Blues, his first solo album, a lot in high school. I didn't really spend Happy and Galoshes is the other one, right?
Right.
I didn't really spend much time with that album. Um, I think that people would call it indie, like 12 Bar Blues. I think that if it came out now, people would call it indie. I don't know if the context around him allowed it to be understood that way now, like at the time. Like when did it come out? Like 98 or 97 or something?
98, like spring of 98, I think.
So, um, even though the whole like alt rock thing kind of arose from the same, like from the indie underground, I mean, difference between indie and alternative is kind of like splitting hairs, I think. I tend to think of it as anything that blew up and ended up on alt rock radio is alternative rock, and anything that stayed underground was indie rock. But that's a whole other can of worms to get into. I think that if Scott Weiland was still around and he put out 12 Bar Blues now and it sounded like it did, I think that people would probably call it an indie album. But also, you know, the whole understanding of what constituted indie music was different in 1998. Like,
Right.
I think it would have had to be a little bit scrappier and sloppier in order for, and maybe a little bit more like basement show music in order for it to be considered indie at the time.
Okay, that's interesting. Do you own a typewriter?
No.
um, what do you have like another book project in the works? Do you have like an unpublished novel in your desk drawer? Like, what's next for you?
I feel like writing a novel. I don't know how anybody writes any fiction ever. Like, I could write nonfiction all day because it's like the story already exists and it's just a matter of finding the story and telling it in a compelling way. Um, but coming up with your own story, No. I feel like any ideas that I've ever had for a fictional story, I'm just like, well, that's cliche. It's hard for me to get past the like, well, this has been done before. This has been done before. That hasn't stopped me from like, it's funny. This has been done before. It probably applies to every music review I've ever written too, but for some reason I can't get over that hump with fiction, even though it would probably be a lot more profitable. Um, I do have some other ideas that I'm kicking around for a next book. Um, there's at least one that I'm trying to get a proposal together for, but it's not far enough along to really talk about it. I view it as sort of a companion piece to Such Great Heights. Um, but yeah, I'm not really ready to, I haven't even presented it to any publishers or anything. Um, and then I have another thing that I might self-publish that would be maybe like more of a multimedia project. Like I would put it online and maybe record a podcast version of it, um, and maybe like on Substack even, uh, and kind of like put it behind a paywall and see what became of it. Yeah, so I have a few different ideas kicking around as far as what the next big creative project will be, but I'm not ready to go public with them yet.
Okay. One of the podcasts I've listened to a lot over the last few years is 60 Songs That Explain the 90s with Rob Harvilla, who I guess is also a Columbus, Ohio resident. Are you
That's right.
are you friends with Rob? Like, do you guys meet for coffee? Do you have
We are friends. We don't hang out as much as I would prefer. Most of the time we spend together is at shows. A lot of times we'll go to the same shows. Um, but also he went to the same college as me, but like 6 years ahead of me. So yeah, I'm kind of like following in his footsteps in a lot of ways, and I think it's amazing that he lives so close to me. And I mean, like he talks a lot of times on his podcast, he'll tell stories about college and like working at the college radio station and all that. It's like I was there a few years after, and it's like I know exactly what he's talking about. So I feel like I'm experiencing the show, the 60 Songs show, on like a deeper level than most people, just because like being in Ohio and going to Ohio University. Um, so yeah, I'm friends with Rob. I think I mean that's probably my favorite podcast as well. I listen to every episode. I listen to it when I go on runs. It's like I'm fiending for more episodes. Although I was on the most recent episode, other than he did like a bonus episode about Jeff Buckley. But before that, the most recent episode, I was the guest talking about this book and talking about Vampire Weekend. And so I appreciated the fact that when he took a break of several months, that I was the last show before that, so that I was like at the top of the queue for
there
months
you
on
go.
end.
Cool. Uh, I know you wanted to talk a little NFL.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was like, if you talk sports and on your show sometimes, and we don't talk sports, I would feel like that was a big omission.
So obviously you can tell Gary's wearing his Patriots gear. He is a Patriots fan, so he is overjoyed. What's been your impression, I guess, of the playoffs this year, the conference championship games that were played yesterday, and the upcoming Super Bowl between the Patriots and Seahawks?
Yeah, so I should preface this by saying that I'm unfortunately a Browns fan,
Ooh.
something that I was born into, and it's a
You guys have
deep.
a Pro Bowl quarterback.
Yeah, I saw that. It's absurd. I saw Matt Harmon, one of the best fantasy football analysts. He posted about Shador being named as a Pro Bowl alternate. He was like, "I'm sure this won't be used disingenuously at all during the offseason by anyone." Um, but yeah, so even though I'm a Browns fan and like following the Browns is so depressing, I've become like a very like hardcore NFL fan, kind of like Rob Lowe with the NFL hat on. Like I just watch every single game that I can, and I think fantasy football was like a big driver for that. Uh, and obviously, like during the fantasy football season, I want to watch every game because I probably have a player. Like when you're in like 5 or 6 leagues or whatever, it's like you've got a lot of different players. But I've become like even when there's not fantasy football factoring into it, it's just like I feel like the NFL and college football to a lesser extent is like my soap opera. So yeah, I felt like the playoffs have been really delivering in terms of the drama of it, like just even who got in, like it was just like kind of a felt like a maybe if not a regime change year, it at least felt like, kind of an interesting in between year
Some new
where we
blood
got a lot of new
injected.
faces in there.
Yep.
And it's just been so exciting to see. I mean, I think even in the first weekend, they said there were more lead changes in the first weekend than there usually are in the entire playoffs. So, I mean, it's been electrifying. I will say that as we've progressed, some of the teams that was hoping would still be hanging on have been eliminated. I was really enjoying the Bears. I enjoyed how they came back from like 24 points down every week and always had some absurd touchdown pass from Caleb Williams. I was hoping that this would be the year for Josh Allen since a lot of his toughest competition was, cleared out of the way by being mediocre this year. But yeah, Gary's Pats uh, supplanted them in the division, and then they got steamrolled out of the playoffs by the Broncos. Not steamrolled. I mean, that was another one of the electric down to the wire overtime games. But yeah, I felt like it felt like even though it kind of sucks not having it's nice having these dominant dynasty teams because they're kind of like I got sick of the Chiefs, but it was cool to experience the Chiefs even though I was ready for a break from the Chiefs. Um, but it was fun to see like sort of like this primordial phase of like who's gonna be the next dynasty and who are gonna be the new Titans of the NFL.
Now you mentioned you're a big Major League Soccer fan. Do you have are you probably not a Reds fan? So are you a Guardians fan?
I was
Both?
actually see being in from Columbus. I just liked what my dad liked, and he I think in the 70s and 60s just chose the teams that were good. So we like the Browns and the Reds. Um, but I honestly don't follow baseball like I used to. Like baseball was my first love. I had my baseball cards, and also the first season that I paid attention to baseball was 1990, and the Reds won the World Series.
Oh, series.
So like that'll make a
Loyal.
fan out of you.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, I think I don't know where I lost interest. I guess it was probably after they busted all the steroids guys because I was very tapped in during the McGuire versus Sosa home run race. Um, but yeah, for me, I think the biggest for me is college football, pro football, and soccer. And I am the rare case where I don't really follow like the most elite soccer. Like I don't have a team in the Premier League that I follow. Uh, I grew up going to Columbus Crew games, and so I just love the Crew. And the U.S. national team as well. Like that was kind of my first exposure to soccer was when the World Cup was here in '94.
Hmm.
I mean, I had played youth soccer, but like that was my first exposure to like professional soccer was World Cup USA '94. I think there's a lot of people who would say that. And so, yeah, I follow the U.S. national team a little bit. I follow the Crew, and I follow college football in terms of like the elites. Like I follow Ohio State because like they were my They were
Is
kind of
that
like
who
the
you root for?
local, yeah, that was my local pro sports franchise growing up was the Ohio State Buckeyes. Uh, and then I married into a family where like it's, like a religious devotion to the Ohio State Buckeyes. I mean, I was already a big fan, but like my wife's family is just like on a whole other level. Her dad was in the marching band and stuff, and yeah, so the Buckeyes are a very big deal in my household. That's kind of controversial too when you go to Ohio University. There's kind of this like complex about Ohio State because OU is smaller and it's in the MAC, and but it predates Ohio State like by many decades. Um, and there's some people I know who went to college with me who like kind of have a stick in their butt about Ohio State, but couldn't be me because I spent my whole childhood loving Ohio State, and so I wasn't about to like flip that switch and turn it off when I went to OU. Although I did go to the OU versus Ohio State football game this year, and I had some cognitive dissonance. I wore an Ohio State t-shirt and an Ohio University hat. Uh,
Okay.
it's like I didn't really want OU to win and mess up Ohio State's season. But I mean, obviously there was a part of me that wanted OU to win because it's like you can't root against your alma mater.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of an odd choice of like this is the game I have to make sure I go to, the one that I'm going to feel the most conflicted about.
All right. One other question here to get you out on. With Super Bowl coming up, we know Bad Bunny is the halftime performer. Green Day is performing, I guess, before the game. What indie band do you think would make the best halftime entertainer for, like, say, next year's Super Bowl?
Ooh, that's a
So,
good one. Uh, well, I think the best in terms of generating takes and discourse would be Geese, who just played on Saturday Night Live this weekend. Their SNL performance was widely beloved and widely hated. I think it was very polarizing. Uh, and they're really blowing up right now. Obviously, they were on SNL. Uh, they've got like their singer Cameron Winter played Carnegie Hall, and he had Paul Thomas Anderson on stage filming him while he was performing. Uh, so they've had this huge glow up, and I don't think that they're gonna get Super Bowl level famous by this time next year. But crazier things have happened. I think that they are just the right combination of like accessible and weird to rub some people the wrong way and rub some people very much the right way. And so I would just love to like read all of the like discourse. That's the thing. I love the music. I love music, but I also love the conversation around the music. And so I feel like Geese would be the choice for like, you know, the takes. But as far as like bands that are covered in my book, like bands from the 2000s and 2010s, um, I think it could be fun to have. I mean, I don't know if we want to count Jack White. Like he's someone who actually could do it, and he just did the
Thanksgiving
the
Day.
Thanksgiving the Lions game. I think the world all united behind Jack White being like totally cool.
Yeah.
I don't know anybody who was had a bad thing to say about that performance. So it's kind of cheating because like he's like a full-fledged rock star now, but he came from the world of independent music. If they put together like a whole uh like the Strokes, White Stripes, Yeah Yeah Yeahs kind of review with like all of those bands from that era, I think that there would be a portion of the audience that would just lose their mind.
Okay. It would.
Interpol, throw them in there. Like have a rotating stage where you're like bringing on every band gets to do their biggest song.
Yeah. I'm just thinking the Killers would make sense like for the next Super Bowl that's in Vegas.
Oh yeah, well, I mean that's another good one where it's like they kind of came from the indie rock world, but I mean, they were on the, or at least they were beloved by indie rock listeners originally, uh, and then but they were on a major label the whole time. But as I talk about in the book, like being on a major label doesn't mean that you're not indie rock. That's a whole other man. There's so many cans of worms that get somewhat explored in the book. The Killers, you're right. They're huge. I think that would actually bring I that would kill. The Killers would kill. Um, you had a better idea than me. I think that Mr. Brightside is actually the most streamed song from the 2000s.
Oh,
Or at
okay.
least the Killers shared this stat. It was like most streamed song from each decade last year. It wasn't like all time. It was like in 2025, here's the biggest song. It was like Iris by the Goo Goo Dolls was the most streamed 90s song of last year, which kind of surprised me. Um, but yeah, the 2000s song was Mr. Brightside. It's really become like the Don't Stop Believin' of a
Yeah, it's like
generation.
a drinking song.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think you're on point there. Like that would be and I think they would bring out a couple of special guests too. Like if they wanted to like troll the whole world, they could bring out Morrissey at the Super Bowl. Because I think Brandon's a big Morrissey fan. Man, they could have such a wide range of guest stars up there with them. I'm really into this idea now. I feel like I want to like manifest the Killers Super Bowl
Do
halftime
it.
show.
All right. His name is Chris DeVille. He's the author of Such Great Heights, The Complete Cultural History of the Indie Rock Explosion. If you're a music fan, pick this up. If you enjoy the early 2000s or 2000s aughts music, definitely pick it up. There is music for days in this book that if you have, luckily there's Spotify and streaming so you can reference every one of these books. He has a bunch of soundtracks for each chapter. Chris, I really enjoyed reading it. Wish you the best of luck. Thank you very much for joining us here tonight on the Brian Lennon Show, and we look forward to some other future projects from you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invite. And thanks for
You're
letting
welcome.
me ramble and ramble and ramble. It was great.
We enjoyed it. All right. For Gary McDaniel, I'm Brian Lennon and Chris DeVille. This is the Brian Lennon Show. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you again next week.
Bye.